Okay, so, when we hear about wars breaking out, we often get these explanations about, like, ideological clashes or threats to national security.
Right.
But I always wonder if there's more to it, like what are the real driving forces behind all the conflict?
Yeah, absolutely. And, we've been looking at this really interesting analysis, and it goes beyond those kind of surface level explanations, right?
Yeah.
It digs deep into the historical and current conflicts and shows how oil, trade, and power are like these constant underlying factors.
Oil, trade, power. It sounds, I don't know, kind of simple at
Oh, I
first.
know what you mean.
But this analysis makes a really strong case. It uses all these examples from World War II to what's happening in Ukraine right now. So if you're listening and you want to really get this, the complex stuff, without getting bogged down, this is the place to be. We're going to break it all down for you, give you those core motivations behind why countries go to war.
Exactly. And this isn't just some theoretical thing. I mean, when you understand these driving forces that the analysis lays out, it's like you get a clearer lens to view like everything that's happening in the world. You can see beyond the headlines and really grasp what's going on. So that's our mission today. We're going to break down these arguments about oil, trade, and power. We'll see how they explain, so many of these conflicts that are shaping, all of our lives.
All right, so let's jump right in with oil, right? It's like the lifeblood of our modern world, powering our economies and transportation.
Yeah.
But, and this is what's crazy, it's also been fueling wars for like forever.
Right, right. And one of the things that really struck me in the analysis was how it connected oil to these like crucial moments in history,
Oh, yeah.
like World War II, specifically Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of things going on, obviously.
Of course.
But the analysis emphasizes how the U.S. oil embargo on Japan put this immense pressure on them. Like, it wasn't just, a minor inconvenience. It was a threat to their military, their industry, even just, their everyday lives. And so the analysis argues that Japan felt like they had no choice but to attack Pearl Harbor. They thought it was the only way to secure the resources, in Southeast Asia.
So it was like a do or die situation for them.
Pretty much.
That's wild.
Yeah, it really puts things in perspective.
Okay, so what about the Gulf War back in 1991?
Well, the analysis is very straightforward. It basically says that Iraq's invasion of Kuwait was all about oil.
Really?
Yeah, they wanted control of Kuwait's massive oil reserves.
I mean, I guess that makes sense, right? Like on the surface, it seems obvious.
It does, but then think about what that means, You control those reserves, and you control those vital shipping routes like the Strait of Hormuz. It gives you so much power on the world stage.
That's true. Whoever controls those choke points, like you said, has a huge advantage. Okay, so
Yep.
let's move on to the Iraq War in 2003. So officially, it was all about weapons of mass destruction, right? But this analysis also acknowledges the idea that, well, maybe access to Iraq's oil reserves was a major factor too.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Iraq had huge oil reserves, some of the largest in the world. And controlling those reserves would have given, whoever controlled them, enormous influence on the global energy market.
All right.
So yeah, the analysis definitely suggests we need to think about how that might have influenced things.
Makes you think, for sure. Okay, and then the analysis also brings up energy security, right? Like how oil importing countries, they really depend on that steady supply of oil.
Yeah, and there's this constant fear, right, that if those supplies get cut off, their economies could like completely collapse.
So the analysis argues that this fear can actually lead to military interventions.
Absolutely. Like if a country feels like its survival depends on securing those oil supplies, they might be willing to use force to do it.
That's kind of scary, actually. And it's not just about the big global powers, right? The analysis mentions how oil-rich countries themselves can become targets.
Right, right. Places like Libya and Venezuela, they've got all this oil wealth, and that makes them really vulnerable to like internal instability and outside interference.
So oil can be a blessing and a curse, I guess.
It definitely seems that way. But this all leads to a really important question that the analysis poses. Like, is oil really the primary driver of all this? Or is there something even deeper going on?
I see where you're going with this. So that brings us to trade, right?
Exactly.
Now, you wouldn't necessarily think that the flow of goods and services would lead to wars, but the analysis lays out a pretty convincing argument about how economic competition can escalate into actual violence.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like, the analysis talks about how trade imbalances, where one country is importing way more than it's exporting,
Right.
that can create a lot of tension.
Makes sense.
And this desire to like dominate economically,
Yeah.
that can lead to real problems. The analysis starts with this historical example, the Opium Wars.
Okay, I've heard of those.
Yeah, they were between Britain and China in the 19th century. And it wasn't just about the opium trade itself. It was more about Britain wanting to fix this huge trade deficit they had with China. They wanted to force China to open up its markets to British goods.
So it was about power, really, like economic power.
Absolutely. And the analysis explains how this desire to control the flow of money, it put immense pressure on the Chinese government, and ultimately it led to war.
Wow. Okay, so then fast forward to the 20th century.
Right.
And the analysis talks about how the economic rivalry between the major European powers was a big factor in the lead up to World War I.
Yeah, I mean, it was this whole tangled web of alliances and nationalism and stuff, but underneath it all was this competition for markets, for resources, for economic dominance.
So it created this really unstable environment.
Exactly. And then, if we jump to a more recent example, there's the U.S.-China trade war, which started a few years ago. Now, granted, it hasn't led to, like, a shooting war yet.
Yeah.
But these tariffs and sanctions, they've definitely strained relations between the two countries. And it's led to increased military activity, especially in places like the South China Sea.
Right, where all those vital trade routes are. So, okay, how did these trade disputes actually turn into wars?
Well, the analysis talks about sanctions and retaliation, like how countries might use economic blockades to pressure their rivals. They use the example of the blockades against Japan before World War II.
Right, Japan felt like it was being strangled economically.
Exactly. And that can definitely push a country towards war.
So sanctions can be a powerful weapon.
They can. And, we've already talked about how control over key trade routes is important.
Yeah, like with oil.
Right.
Yeah.
And those disputes in the South China Sea, they're not just about territory. They're about who controls those shipping lanes that carry trillions of dollars in goods every year.
Right, those are the arteries of the global economy. Okay, and then the analysis brings up another interesting point about how shifts in the global economy can lead to conflict.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. So, like, when a new economic power emerges and challenges the existing order, it can create all this instability and friction.
Like a power struggle on a global scale.
Exactly. And the analysis suggests that while trade wars might not always directly cause full-scale wars, they can definitely lay the groundwork. They
Right.
create the tensions and rivalries
Yeah.
that can escalate into something much bigger.
So if oil and trade are these major drivers of conflict, what's the ultimate force behind it all?
Well, according to the analysis, it's power. Plain and simple.
Power.
Power. It's the desire to control resources, to shape political systems, to basically dominate the world stage. And that's where we really see the deep motivations behind these conflicts.
Okay, so give me some examples. How does this power dynamic play out in the real world?
Well, the analysis points to the Cold War. Now, obviously, the U.S. and the Soviet Union never went to war directly.
Right.
But it was this decades-long struggle for dominance, for ideological supremacy, for military power.
Yeah.
And that struggle played out all over the world through proxy wars and this constant threat of escalation.
So it was like a global chess match.
Exactly. And then the analysis talks about the Syrian civil war, which is a really good example of how different global powers can get involved in these conflicts and use them to advance their own interests.
It's like a proxy war.
Exactly. The U.S., Russia, Iran, they're all backing different sides in Syria, and it's all about gaining influence in that region.
So Syria becomes this battleground for a much bigger power struggle.
Right. And then, of course, there's the war in Ukraine. And while oil and trade are definitely factors, the analysis is very clear that at its core, this conflict is about geopolitical power.
Okay, let's dig into that. What are the power dynamics at play in Ukraine?
Well, for one thing, Russia has always been very concerned about NATO expansion. They see it as a direct threat to their security and their influence in the region.
Right.
And then you have the U.S. and its allies who are trying to contain Russia, to weaken its power and to support Ukraine's independence.
So Ukraine becomes this like pivotal point in this whole global power struggle.
Exactly. It's a battleground for the future of Europe and, really the world.
Okay, so this war in Ukraine, it really is a perfect example of how all these things, oil, trade, and power, can come together and create a huge international conflict.
It really is. And, the analysis argues that this is how most wars happen. It's rarely just about one thing. It's about this complex mix of motivations and interests.
Okay, so as we wrap up, I want to look ahead a bit. What about the future of war? Like, how might these dynamics change in the years to come?
Well, the analysis talks about how the nature of war itself is evolving, especially with all the new technologies.
Okay, so what might be the new flashpoints for conflict?
Well, the analysis suggests that oil might not be the only critical resource anymore. There are other things that could become just as important, if not more so.
Like what?
Things like lithium and rare earth metals. These are essential for all the new tech, electric vehicles, smartphones, all that stuff. And as demand for these resources grows, they could become new sources of conflict.
I could see that happening. And what about water?
Water's going to be huge. It's already becoming scarce in many parts of the world, and climate change is only going to make that worse.
Yeah, that's a big one. And then there's cyber warfare, right?
Absolutely. Cyber warfare is already a real threat, and it's only going to get more sophisticated. It's a whole new dimension of conflict.
So we've got all these new technologies and resources that could become sources of conflict. But at the end of the day, it all comes back to power, doesn't it?
It really does. That fundamental drive for dominance, for influence, it's not going away anytime soon.
So no matter how technology changes, the human element remains the same. All right, so let's recap. We've looked at this argument that oil, trade, and power are these key driving forces behind war. We've seen how they've played out throughout history and how they're shaping the conflict in Ukraine. And we've even peeked into the future to see what might be coming next.
And, the goal here is to give you a new way to think about these complex issues. Because when you understand these underlying drivers, you can make more sense of the world around you.
And that brings us to the big question that the analysis leaves us with. Will we ever truly break free from the cycle of war? It's a tough one.
It is, but hopefully by understanding these dynamics, we can start to find ways to build a more peaceful future.
So the next time you see a news story about a conflict somewhere in the world, think about these things. Think about the role of oil, trade, and power. It might just give you a deeper understanding of what's really going on.
I think that's a great takeaway. Thanks.
Thank you.